Hit me with it. Just give it to me straight. I came a long way just to see you, Mary. Just, least you can do is level with me. What are my chances?
Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
Well, Mark, it may be that Jim Carrey had a very remote chance with Lauren Holly. Actually, they got married for a while.
1 in a million, apparently.
Yeah. There's an even lesser chance that I will ever sort of be a big fan of, I think, reggae. It's not my jam.
Yeah, I got to tell you, you got to respect that long pause in that scene.
Yeah.
Like, they just dragged that silence out a bit longer than anybody else would have. It was perfect.
It sure hits harder when you're listening to it as opposed to watching it in the movie.
It's true. It's great. And you don't like the reggae? Wait, you don't like reggae? What's up?
I'm not a reggae guy, man.
May Bob Marley strike you down. Bob, I call upon you. Strike Ben down for his transgressions.
Are you a reggae fan? You got Bob Marley albums or something?
I mean, yeah. Who doesn't like a good Bob Marley album? Come on.
Come
on, Ben.
All right. Listen, you're going to have to give me the tour someday.
All right. Well, let's just speaking of tours, we got a tour of an episode here today, right?
Yeah, friends, we worked on this one real hard, actually, because it's such an abstract concept. Today, we're going to talk about math. We're going to talk about dice. We're going to talk about these things that could turn into a lecture, a college lecture in a boring classroom, and we don't want that. So we're doing our best here today, and we're going to talk about how to work with the odds, playing the odds, working with your dice so that they can be kind of charmed to help you tell your stories.
Yeah. Dice aren't just, dice are the third storyteller, Ben. Like, we talk about this all the time. There are 3, entities at the table: the player, the GM, and there's the dice. And the dice don't care about your story. They don't care about the player's story. They don't care about the GM story. They don't care. They have their own story to tell. And we're going to try to teach people a little bit how to massage those dice to tell the type of story you want them to tell, right?
Exactly. Something that's interesting about dice is that for people that are really interested in RPGs and the G part, right? Games, the element of this that's game-like, dice give you a sense of fair play.
Ben, let's get into it. Let's talk about one of my favorite things, dice. I love dice. I buy them. I'm a goblin. They call me a dice
goblin. You're a dice goblin. Have you counted how many? Do you have like a display case for your dice?
Shut your mouth right now.
Okay. All right. So friends, here's the thing. Dice 101. The first thing to talk about here, if you're going to get smart about dice, then start by getting to know each dice's average value. And I'll give you a really quick little trick you can use to help yourself out. The trick is think about what half of the value of that dice is, and then add 0.5. So if you're thinking about a D6, for example, it's 3.5. That's how you know what the average value of a dice is. A lot of systems might round up. So, for example, when you're looking at D&D has kind of a rule where you can add the average value of a dice as your minimum hit point bump per level. So like for a D8, it's 5. In reality, it's like a 4.5, but of course you can't ever roll that.
Ben, what is knowing the average dice going to help us out? How is that going to assist us?
Well, so here's the thing. The reason you want to know about average dice values is because you need to know what to expect when you roll a whole bunch of dice. Okay. And there's a couple versions of this that I think are important. One is when it comes to test rolls. And when you multiply a fraction by a fraction, you end up getting an even smaller fraction, right? In other words, your probability goes down the more times you roll checks on top of checks. So one of the things you can do if you're trying to make your players feel oh so not heroic is you can give them a sequence of 3 or 4 or 10 rolls or whatever it's going to be to get some task done. And gosh darn it, wouldn't you know, the third roll they made turns out they're always failing.
And this is something you see. I've seen GMs do this. I'm not going to name names. You know who you are.
And anyway, we know who you are.
Yeah. No, anyway, this would be the thing where the player, like let's say the GM wants you to open a door or a locked door, and they all of a sudden say, "Hey, I need you to roll a perception check to look, to discover the lock." Okay, all right, we rolled that perception check. We know there's a lock there. Now they're like, "I need you to make a investigation check to see what kind of lock it is." Well, okay. Now I need you to make a dice roll to see if you open the lock. Okay, we've done 3 checks now just to get past a locked door.
Yeah.
What does that do for odds, Ben?
Really bad. Really bad.
Yeah.
So, think about what your margin of success is in each of those. You can then sort of start multiplying decimals by decimals. Look, I'm not going to bother you with the math. The point is, it's lower than any one of those rolls, which means that, the more you do this, the worse it's going to be.
The basic idea is the more dice you ask a player to roll in order to achieve a goal, the more likely they're going to fail.
You were talking before about storytelling import.
Yeah.
My example of this was, I remember a game I was playing where this is like the, how about a shout out to the old Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness book from Palladium.
You hit me right in my heart, man.
I got some really fond memories around that game.
Yeah.
So we're in this urban environment. There's some stuff going on. I don't know which of 2 buildings to go up into. And so I go up into this one building looking for the bad guys, realize that in fact, they're in the other building. And in fact, as I look across, I can see through the window, they're up to no goods and stuff like that. So I'm like, oh, I got to get over there fast. But luckily, Mark, I have one of those kind of gas-powered grappling hook Batman type guns. And I'm going to swing over there. It's going to be great. I'm going to crash through the window. It's going to be so cool.
That sounds amazing, Ben. I cannot wait to see you make that one roll and get over there.
That's exactly right. How many rolls do you think I made? I had to make a roll to place the grappling hook gun on the thing. I had to make a roll to essentially successfully execute the swing. I had to make a roll to break through the glass. And then I took some damage, by the way, breaking through the glass. And basically, I regretted the whole thing, and I felt stupid.
Why did Neil do this to you?
It wasn't Neil, I will say. But at any rate,
all right. No offense, Neil. No offense, Neil. Love you, guy. Hey, so they just had you do too many rolls, created too many obstacles.
Right.
Yeah, it happens a lot. Like there's an idea, like we always would say, and we kind of joked about, like you couldn't sneak into any sort of like enemy base because there's too much dice involved.
Yeah. There's going to be like 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 like stealth rolls, and somewhere in there you're going to screw up.
Yes, somewhere it's going to happen. So let's talk about like you had mentioned something we were talking about a little bit. You called it the disappointing fireball. Like what is a sad fireball you're talking about? Yeah,
the disappointing fireball. Okay, so we've talked about test rolls and what happens when you start throwing a bunch of dice around for that, and how the implication there is that you're going to have a lower and lower chance of success the more of those you roll. With an effect roll, that's a test roll that we were talking about a moment ago. With an effect roll, which is how much damage did I do or how long does this thing last, the more dice you roll, the more likely it is that you're going to get the middle part of that average, right? So if you think about it for a moment, fireball in D&D is 8d6. Every d6, we already said that's about 3.5. So if you just say, all right, well, okay, 3.5 times 2 is 7. And then that times 4 more to get 8 is 28 points, right?
Yeah.
So the average fireball score is 28 points. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is your chances of getting a somewhat number that's closer to a 28 than it is to a 48, which is the maximum you could get from 8d6, is really high. The chances of you getting a 48-point damage fireball is super low. But of course, when you look at 8d6, you're thinking, oh, this is epic.
Oh, yeah, it's tumbling around. But, at the end of the day, Ben, it's just not enough butter spread over too much bread. It always comes up a little underwhelming, doesn't it?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think it helps you to do then is to kind of go, wait, what is the real value of this thing? And if you ask me, the real value of that fireball is not the 8d6. I mean, it kind of is. But the real value is the fact that it's got a 20-foot radius. And I can collect 5, 10 maybe people in there if I'm lucky. Who knows?
That's where the real joy of that and the lightning bolt, how many people can you get in that lightning bolt? How many people can you get in that fireball? That's where the giggles come out of the player, They're they're cackling maniacally when they see everybody lined up in that lightning bolt formation. And you're like, did I really just line them up like that?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, and then relatedly, right, this means that when you do see a player roll, I think you and I were playing a game one time where I think somebody threw a fireball and it did like 43 or 46 points of damage or something like that.
Yeah.
And because we knew like what the odds of that happening were, like, being very low, I didn't know the exact odds, but like I just knew that's like a really rare result.
Yeah.
And you just go, wow, that's so amazing.
Yeah, and those don't happen very often with the fire. The fireball is typically a little underwhelming. So, if you want to increase the joy of your fireball, make sure you get more people in it. Get them all involved. So right. Anyway, that's where the probability and all that stuff comes out. So think about that, you guys. Think about how all that works.
Yeah. Something else I want to mention is when we're talking about how multiple dice tend to create more probability at the center of that curve, one of the things that's relevant to as well is other systems that don't use single dice for their test results. So, for example, if you're playing GURPS or you're playing Champions or some of these games that might use, like, let's say, a 3d6 roll, or in Traveler, they use a 2d6 roll. It's valuable to know that the results in the center of that, right? For 3d6, it'd be a 10 or 11. For Traveler, a 2d6 would be a 7. When you see results coming up around there, how much more rare that 3 or that 18 is, or the 2 or the 12 is, right? And so that's really important to know, because what that tells you is that, like, if I'm rolling a single dice roll, like a d20, I'm going to hit a 20 more often than a 4d6, for example, is going to roll more than 20.
Okay, you're getting into a lot of numbers here, Ben, and I appreciate that. But let's talk about like how the dice can tell stories. Let's talk about storytelling with the dice. So I think that's when we come down to it as a GM, from the GM side, when we're asking of the players to roll something, in our heart of hearts, we essentially want them to succeed, right?
That's right.
For the most part.
I mean, that's what we tell the players.
That's what we tell the players. Sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes I want them to fail, but that's beside the point. But 90% of the time, 85% of that time, to maybe even 70% of the time, I want them to
Speaking
succeed.
of multiplied probability.
But generally, most of the time, I want them to succeed. So when we're talking about these dice, we're going to talk about, like, what are ways we can allow them to succeed, and how do these dice tell different stories, right?
Now, you have some interesting options here. You have some interesting thinking around an example of the group stealth check. And I'm sure we've all had that moment where we go through the game, and whatever the rules are for how groups do stealth, there's that moment where something either seems too easy or too hard, or maybe weird. You didn't expect that result. Mark, what are the options when it comes to this, and how does that tell us a different story with these different options?
I've seen 3 big options be used at the table most of the time. And I'm going to go through those 3, and I'm going to present a 4th option as what I think is a better idea in any case. So option number 1, this is kind of old school D&D at its finest. Individual rules, single failure ends it all. This is a realistic approach. If one person stumbles and makes a noise, the group's cover is kind of blown.
Yeah.
Or at least those eyes are looking at that one person in the plate armor who messed up the roll.
This happens in movies all the time, right? Like that one guy who sneezes.
Yeah. The downside of this is that, again, we talked about, like, the more dice you have people roll, the more likely that failure is going to be. And there's always that one person who did not put anything in stealth.
Right.
And he's going to drag everybody down with him.
Well, and relatedly, right? Like, this does, I guess, kind of undercut that thing where a lot of we talked about balancing the party. And when you're talking about people that maybe didn't put any points into stealth, I mean, people don't intend to put points into stealth because they think that other people are covering that, right?
Yeah. So we're talking about a group stealth check here, though. We all need to sneak it. We want to sneak into this place. It's kind of part of the story. Even Conan snuck into the place, even after hitting that chain. We all saw it. His foot hit that chain, and we know that would have made a lot of noise. But the score was so loud you couldn't hear it. But now I'm just digressing.
Right.
So option number 2,
Here we go.
averaging the rolls. This is where everybody rolls and the results are averaged to determine that group's success. This allows those people who have really good stealth checks to kind of skew the entire average of the party.
Right. Offset the weaker players.
The good news is it smooths out those extreme rolls. It mitigates the impact of a single bad roll. The downside is it's just not that realistic. It doesn't really even tell a very good story. Like when you're telling this at the table, it doesn't narratively make a lot of sense, does it?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is for the individual roles, the example you covered a moment ago, that's maybe good if you're trying to do something really realistic and make it feel really dangerous. And boy, everybody's got to succeed.
Yeah, the tension's high in that first one. Whereas the second one, it's lacking drama. It's lacking that tension that the first one offered. But what it does allow is more success.
All right.
So number 3, this is the one that you use in the D&D Player's Handbook.
Okay.
This is the one that I see most of the times at the game table. If half or more of the group succeeds, the whole group succeeds. This is like codified in the rules, right?
Yeah.
This is a very high chance of group success. It keeps the game moving, prevents 1 or 2 people's bad rolls to spoil everything. But I don't know. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Okay.
Like narratively, like why would 3 people's success negate the 2 horrible rolls we just saw? So let's talk about a 4th option.
Yeah. Okay. So you don't like that one, but you do have what do you call this 4th option?
I think we're just going to let the skills lead the way here. So what we would typically do, there's different ways you can go about this. There's a few different avenues. I'm going to present 2 different ways. This is where you'd let your best stealth character go first.
Okay. So high skill roll person goes first. And I suppose if you're doing a different kind of thing instead of stealth, you'd say whatever the high skill is for that.
Correct. It could be any, keep in mind, guys, I'm using stealth as an example. It could be any skill in any game, in any place. This could be applied to anything.
Got it.
So I'm using stealth because it's probably the most common one. So you send your best stealth person first. Imagine this person is identifying the quietest path. People are watching him move from shadow to shadow. They're getting an idea like, that's where I need to move. Their success should directly influence the rest of the group in a couple different ways. One, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, maybe you give advantage on the following people's stealth should the first person succeed. That would allow even those people with clunky armor to be able to kind of mitigate that horrible, role they might have by giving that advantage.
And to your point too, right? That means that there's kind of an in-game dramatic rationale, right? Like the guy with the clunky armor is watching and he sees how that works.
Correct. And then there's another example. I like this one a lot. We've been playing Traveler. Traveler does this thing called task chain. And when you succeed, you can give your other party members a bonus. So like, let's say you're playing a D20 type game and you roll that dice and you succeed by, let's say you succeed by 5. Well, then you can kick that 5 over to the next person. And if that person succeeds, they can kick that over to the next person. So, or you could just have that 5 be a static bonus given to everybody who goes behind them.
What's interesting about the way they do it in Traveler is that the last person to roll is the person who determines whether or not this task is successful or not. Every roll that precedes that is just creating a modifier for that last roll. And it's interesting to think about what would happen if you applied that to some other systems, right? Like what if the group stealth check in D&D, you started with conversely, like the worst off person, and then whatever the modifiers ultimately shook out to be with whatever house rule you're going to make for that, right? That meant that your super stealthy character would go into their role with like a -4, let's say if everybody was awful or something, or disadvantage, or you could pick out what it was going to be. But the point is everything then gets decided on that one roll, which becomes really dramatic.
So my concept here, Ben, I had the person with the best score go first so they could show the others. We're talking about telling a story.
Yeah.
This person is showing them where to step, where the shadows are. Follow me. I'll lead you there.
Yeah.
And so you could do this with a lot of other skill checks. It makes more narrative sense. It tells a story. But here's the thing. You wanted them to succeed, and you've stacked the dice in the favor of the person with the best chance to succeed. And you've carried on that success into the other people who have a less chance. So you're basically stacking the dice at the same time you're making a very dynamic scene and getting the players engaged and getting them excited about that skill check.
Now, one of the things you and I talked about as we're looking at some of these examples is that all of these examples can work for you in different circumstances, right? You might decide that you don't necessarily want to make an extended exercise out of this stealth check or this skill check that you're making or what have you. And in those cases, you might want to go with just something quick where everybody rolls, we see the majority, that's fine, we're going to move on. In other cases, you might want to make this a really kind of interesting narrative obstacle. So I think it's really great that these are all just different tools in your toolbox.
Yeah, and also think about how do we stack the dice in the favor of the players without it being so obvious, maybe?
Right.
Is the word I'm saying? Like these are a little sneaky ways to give your players that edge that you want them to have.
Like this actually makes them feel more heroic. If they're managing to roll the dice, the outcome is uncertain, but you've given them a little bit of an edge. Well, guess what? When they succeed, they're going to feel like, yeah, that was really cool. I did something.
It's kind of the opposite of what do you call your mountain? What'd you call that?
I called it the multiplied probability mountain.
We're now using the multiple probabilities in the favor of the players rather than against.
What are some other things we can do? We've been talking about the import of storytelling, and now we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit to just some of the mechanical things you can do. And we're kind of breaking this out by test rolls. What kinds of ways can you modify test rolls or damage rolls? And what kind of ways can you modify damage rolls, or how can those work? And so I'm just going to go down this list. It's going to be real quick. With test rolls, if you want to change the chances of success for your players, you can raise or lower whatever that static difficulty is, right? Your locked door could have a difficulty of 15 or 25.
Yeah.
Static modifiers, right? This is when you add a +1 or a +2 or a plus specific number to somebody's roll. That's kind of the flip side of it, right? Because now you're modifying the dice roll. You're not modifying the difficulty number. One thing to keep in mind about that is that you remember the thing we were saying earlier about how there's a curve when you're using multiple dice rolls? If I add a, say, +3 to a D20 roll, my odds are better by about 15%. If I add a +3 to, say, a 3D6 roll, they're higher than that, much higher than that. Keep in mind that when you're using those kind of multiple dice test systems, that static modifiers can get disproportionately influential the higher they get. And if you don't want to mess with that, you can always do the thing that D&D and Traveler do, where they talk about advantage or disadvantage. You can just add dice. That's a way of kind of simplifying modifiers and keeping it simple, which is kind of nice. I really liked when they did advantage and disadvantage, because all of a sudden I didn't have to remember quite as many things.
Yeah.
Are you a fan, or did you prefer like the older system with more static modifiers?
No, I was advantage, disadvantage was a real revelation, honestly. I thought it made a lot of sense. I think it might be overused a bit at this point, but I liked it. I thought it was very simple, and it was a very way to give a real tangible, I want this to succeed kind of vibe.
Another thing you can do is you can also let people roll group checks. And we've just talked about an example of those kinds of group checks. Group checks can be things where everybody's working on the same problem, or it could be more like one character is helping another character. And so other kinds of bonuses that we're going to talk about could be given to them. When you're doing things where characters are helping each other, remember the thing about multiplied probability if the person has to roll a dice to see if they're eligible to help the other person, because then you can make it more difficult than it's worth. You can add minor dice, right? In D&D, they do this with blessed spells. You can add a D4 to your ability checks. You can also multiply test opportunities if it's usually a single point of failure. If you think that it's something that you want to give them a chance to recover. So like an example of this would be like climbing rolls. I don't know about you, but like, you want to give players that occasional thing where they're hanging on some rope over a precipice, but then if they screw up their climbing roll, like that would be it. That would be death.
In life, you're done.
Yeah.
But in a D&D game, that means your companion who's near you gets a chance to grab you.
Right. It could mean that, or it could mean maybe you're going to roll a saving throw to see if you can grab the edge of something. Or usually when I'm in a kind of like a fail or die, succeed or die kind of thing, I will try to find something that lets the players make a reroll if they can.
Yeah, don't put your players in precarious situations that they can't get out of. If death is on the line and you don't want it to be on the line, don't put it on the line.
That's right. That's a good way to put it. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is something that I actually think more people should do more with, and I think it's great. And we've seen more of this. We've talked about meta-currencies, and examples of this would be inspiration in D&D, or heroic action points, or resolve, or any of the other kinds of things that let you reroll a dice or make a small dramatic edit, right? And what's great about these options as ways to kind of modify the world a little bit is you've given them to the players in a limited quantity. And so usually these are a way of representing their luck or their innate heroism, being the kind of the main characters. And so if you give them that opportunity, I think what's great is that you then don't have to worry about it too much, because that's just an opportunity for the players to spend that currency, and it heightens the situation a bit more when, I get down to the final room where the big bad guy is and I've got like maybe 1 point left.
Saving up all my bennies for this battle,
Yeah. So wonderful. Okay, so we've talked about test rolls. Damage rolls, some interesting stuff to know about damage rolls when it comes to how those kind of things get modified. Two maybe things worth mentioning here. Some systems have what they call exploding dice. And I was curious about what happens to the average damage that dice do when they've got exploding dice. So an example, if you haven't come across the exploding dice concept, some systems will have a mechanic where if you throw the dice, and let's say I'm throwing 4d6, if I get a 6 on any of those dice, then I actually get to re-roll that dice and add the new result to the old result. And so
that's really fun. Just a side tangent. I think, Ben, you had made a game and we had played it online, and you had autoed the things so that the dice would explode should they explode.
Yeah.
And I just remember rolling some dice and having a D6 absolutely have a seizure on the table. And it just kept rolling. I must have rolled 3 times in a row. And we were all like, whoa.
That's great. That is not usual. I found this fascinating. It makes sense when you think about it, and I won't unpack it all. But essentially, the lower the denomination of the dice, the more it's going to tend to add over time. And if you think about it, it's because the odds of you coming up with that exploding number are higher. So
it is a bit fun way to kind of solve that fireball problem with it being boring.
Yeah. A friend of mine says it makes things swingy, which I think is a nice way to put it.
That's a great way to put it.
The other thing you can do, I learned this trick from Chris Perkins of D&D fame. He will actually, instead of rolling lots of dice, he'll just sort of figure out what the averages are for a handful of the dice that would be part of a roll, and then he'll make that a static modifier. So, for example, let's say I've got a 6d6 attack that I'm going to hit you with, and I don't want to do the math all the time. Here's what I'm going to do. I know that the average for 4d6 is 14, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll 2d6 and add 14, and that's it. Or maybe I'll even roll 1d6 and add 17, and that's it. But the point is, I'm making it really fast. I get a little bit of variability, but I'm exchanging dice for a static value.
What's the point, Chris Perkins?
I think it makes him feel like he's moving faster. Okay. All right, friends. We have talked about all the different ways that you can modify the dice. We've talked about the importance of thinking through the storytelling implications of this. We've talked a bit about probability so that you can think through what happens when you multiply dice rolls when you're doing tests, or why it is that high numbers of dice to roll may or may not suit your purposes. And I hope this gives you all a sense of how the dice can be charmed, and this third storyteller can be helping you tell your story instead of thwarting it.
All right, Ben, I got a tune-up for you. This is my tune-up.
Oh, we're tuning you up today.
Yeah, because you're my pulp expert here. I have a pulp character I'm working on for a game.
Okay.
The idea is this is a stuntman who's also a pilot. We'll call him a pilot stuntman.
Okay.
Yeah. So is
he a stunt pilot? Does he do trick flying?
Well, he's a stuntman, but he likes to fly on the side, or we'll say. He's just a reckless dude.
All right.
So we got this stuntman character in the game. Well, think about the 1930s, early Hollywood era, maybe kind of out of the Buster Keaton kind of mold. And I'm trying to think of ideas for this character that would give him a little bit of life, a little bit of like pizzazz. And I'm struggling here a little bit. All I can think of is Brad Pitt in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I don't want to just do Brad Pitt in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But like, I'm thinking like maybe this guy's been in the industry for a while. Maybe he's got a few injuries. Help me out, man. What do you got for me?
I'd say lean into the aviation piece because aviation at this time is incredible. And there's really no FAA at this point, right? If you can put a plane together, you can fly it at whatever altitude you can think of. The skies are not crowded. I don't even think there's like established traffic lanes up there at this point. So, navigation is kind of by map and looking around. They don't have radar navigation for a little bit yet. I think they get some of that like later in the 30s or maybe it's late 20s, but it's certainly not widespread. So the other things I would think of when you're thinking about movies to reference, obviously The Rocketeer. It's a well-known thing.
Oh, yeah.
You could be doing stuff where your character is a stunt pilot, where he's a racer, where he's somebody who does aerobatic stunts for crowds. That kind of stuff would draw a crowd back then.
A wing walker.
A wing walker. Yeah.
There you go.
So that would be one thing you could do that I think could be kind of fun, being a daredevil pilot, emphasis on the daredevil piece. And then another thing you could do is think about how his Hollywood contacts might need to get driven around. And so you might actually have an interesting network of people because that one head of the studio or that one bombshell actress, they need to get from LA to San Francisco or San Diego or.
Yeah, no, I could totally see leaning into the pilot aspect of his stunt work, particularly when you look at like maybe those early movies where they're doing like maybe they want to film a dogfight or something like that. This would be the guy they hire for.
Exactly. I mean, they have stunt drivers today and they have stunt pilots today. And so you were probably one of those prototypical characters.
Thank you, man. I got a little vision. I got a way to go. Consider me tuned up, Ben. Thank you.
All right. That's great. Well, you guys, we're going to consider you tuned up until next week, but we would love to hear your ideas for tune-up questions and so forth. Send us ideas, comments, crazy thoughts that you might like us to talk about with you through this podcast. You can email us at tabletoptuneup@gmail.com or leave us a comment on our YouTube channel when we post this on YouTube. Mark, the last word is yours.
Keep those dice rolling, guys.
Come get your tune up, it's time for your tune up, you gave me that tune.